The crystal champagne flute shattered against the marble floor as Victoria Chen watched her entire world crumble in a single moment. Standing in her penthouse overlooking downtown Seattle, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been the most important business meeting of her life, she stared at the woman she had dismissed as nothing more than hired help just moments before. The same woman who had just delivered a flawless presentation in Mandarin to the most powerful investors in Asia, securing the deal that would save Victoria's company from bankruptcy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Chen had built her tech empire from nothing, transforming a small software startup into Chen Dynamics, one of Seattle's fastest-growing companies. At 34, she commanded respect in boardrooms across the Pacific Northwest, her sharp business acumen and relentless drive earning her a spot on Forbes's, quote, 40 under 40 inches list 3 years running. Her penthouse apartment on the 42nd floor of the Columbia Tower reflected her success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Elliott Bay, minimalist furniture that cost more than most people's cars, and walls lined with awards recognizing her contributions to the tech industry. But success had come at a price. Victoria's meteoric rise had been fueled by an almost pathological need to prove herself, a driving force that stemmed from growing up as the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had sacrificed everything for her education. Her parents, Li and Ming Chen, had arrived in America with nothing but determination and the clothes on their backs. They had worked multiple jobs, her father as a night janitor while studying for his engineering degree, her mother cleaning houses during the day and taking English classes at night. Their sacrifice had been singular in purpose, to give their daughter opportunities they never had. The pressure of living up to their expectations had shaped Victoria into a perfectionist who trusted no one completely and demanded excellence from everyone around her. She spoke fluent Mandarin, a skill her parents had insisted upon, but in her professional life, she rarely acknowledged her heritage, believing that in the predominantly white tech industry, her success depended on being seen as American first and foremost. This philosophy had served her well until 6 months ago, when everything began to unravel. A series of failed product launches, combined with the departure of key clients to competitors, had left Chen Dynamics hemorrhaging money. The company's latest software platform, which was supposed to revolutionize cloud computing for small businesses, had been plagued with security vulnerabilities that led to a devastating data breach. Within weeks, clients were fleeing, investors were pulling out, and Victoria found herself facing the very real possibility of losing everything she had built. The final blow came when her chief technology officer, James Morrison, whom she had trusted implicitly, was discovered to have been selling proprietary code to a competitor. The betrayal cut deep, not just professionally but personally, as Victoria had considered James one of the few people in her inner circle who truly understood her vision. His defection left her scrambling to rebuild her technical team while fighting off lawsuits from affected clients and trying to maintain investor confidence. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and Victoria had reached out to every contact in her network, hoping to find a lifeline. That lifeline came in the form of Zhang Wei, a billionaire investor from Shanghai who controlled a vast network of Chinese companies looking to expand into the American market. Zhang's investment group, Golden Dragon Ventures, had the capital and connections to not only save Chen Dynamics, but transform it into a global powerhouse. The meeting with Zhang and his team had taken months to arrange. Victoria had called in every favor, leveraged every relationship, and even paid a substantial consulting fee to a firm that specialized in Chinese business culture to ensure she made the right impression. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Zhang was notoriously selective about his investments, and his team was known for conducting due diligence that bordered on the obsessive. One misstep, one cultural faux pas, and Victoria knew she would lose her only chance at salvation. As the meeting date approached, Victoria had thrown herself into preparation with the same intensity that had built her company. She studied Chinese business customs, memorized the backgrounds of every member of Zhang's team, and rehearsed her presentation countless times. She even hired additional staff to ensure her penthouse would be perfect for hosting the meeting, including a cleaning service that came highly recommended by other executives in her building. That's how Maria Santos had entered her life, though at the time, Victoria had barely noticed her. Maria was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. She worked for Elite Domestic Services, a company that catered to Seattle's wealthy elite, and had been assigned to Victoria's penthouse as part of the expanded cleaning crew. What Victoria didn't know was that Maria Santos was not who she appeared to be. Born Maria Elena Rodriguez Santos in Mexico City, she had come to the United States 15 years earlier as a teenager, following her mother, who had secured work as a live-in nanny for a wealthy family in California. Maria's childhood had been spent in relative comfort in Mexico, where her father was a respected professor of linguistics at Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, and her mother taught literature at a prestigious private school. The family's comfortable middle-class life had been shattered when Maria's father was killed in a car accident, leaving her mother to raise 3 children alone on a teacher's salary. Desperate to provide for her family, Maria's mother had accepted the nanny position in America, bringing 15-year-old Maria with her while leaving her 2 younger sons with relatives. The transition to life in America had been brutal for Maria. Despite being highly intelligent and well-educated in Spanish, she struggled with English and found herself relegated to menial jobs to help support her family. What her employers didn't know was that Maria possessed an extraordinary gift for languages. By the time she was 18, she was fluent not only in Spanish and English, but also in French, which she had studied in school, and Portuguese, which she had learned from Brazilian friends. Her linguistic abilities had caught the attention of Dr. Elizabeth Warren, not the politician but a linguistics professor at UCLA, who employed Maria's mother. Dr. Warren had recognized Maria's potential and helped her secure a scholarship to study at the university while working part-time to support herself. Maria had thrown herself into her studies with the same determination that had brought her family to America, majoring in international business with a focus on Asian markets. It was during her junior year that Maria had developed a fascination with Chinese culture and language. What started as a required course in Mandarin had evolved into a passion that consumed her free time. She spent hours in conversation with Chinese exchange students, attended every cultural event she could find, and even spent a summer working at a Chinese import company in Los Angeles to immerse herself in the business culture. By the time she graduated, Maria was not only fluent in Mandarin, but possessed a deep understanding of Chinese business practices, social hierarchies, and cultural nuances that many American executives spent years trying to master. She had dreamed of using these skills to build a career in international business, perhaps working for a company that facilitated trade between the Americas and Asia. But dreams and reality had proven to be vastly different things. Despite her qualifications, Maria had found doors consistently closed to her. Her resume, impressive as it was, couldn't overcome the fact that she lacked the connections and pedigree that seemed essential for success in international business. Job interviews that started promisingly would inevitably end with polite rejections, and Maria began to suspect that her appearance and name were working against her in ways that were impossible to prove, but equally impossible to ignore. After months of fruitless job searching, Maria had reluctantly taken work with Elite Domestic Services, telling herself it was temporary while she continued to look for opportunities in her chosen field. The irony was not lost on her that she was cleaning the offices and homes of the very executives who had rejected her applications, but she needed the income, and the work allowed her the flexibility to continue networking and job hunting. What Maria hadn't expected was how invisible domestic work would make her. To the wealthy clients she served, she was simply part of the background, present but not worthy of attention or conversation. This invisibility had become both a source of frustration and an unexpected advantage, as it allowed her to observe the business world from a unique perspective, listening to phone calls and meetings that revealed far more about companies and executives than any annual report ever could. It was this invisibility that had made Victoria Chen dismiss her so completely. During the weeks leading up to the crucial meeting with Jiang Wei's team, Maria had worked in Victoria's penthouse multiple times, always maintaining the professional silence that was expected of domestic staff. Victoria had passed her in hallways, spoken around her during phone calls, and treated her as nothing more than a piece of furniture that happened to be able to dust and vacuum. Victoria's behavior wasn't born of malice, but rather of the compartmentalization that had become second nature to her. In her world, there were people who mattered to her business and people who didn't, and domestic staff fell firmly into the latter category. She had trained herself to focus only on what was essential to her success, and small talk with the help was not essential. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. This dynamic had been particularly evident on the morning of the Zhangwei meeting. Victoria had been in her office since 5 a.m., making final adjustments to her presentation and coordinating with her assistant to ensure every detail was perfect. The stakes were so high that she had barely slept in 3 days, surviving on coffee and nervous energy as she obsessed over every possible scenario. Maria had arrived at 7 a.m. as scheduled, part of the team ensuring the penthouse would be spotless for the afternoon meeting. She had moved through the apartment efficiently, dusting surfaces that were already immaculate and polishing fixtures that gleamed, all while Victoria paced nearby, rehearsing her presentation in a mixture of English and what Maria recognized as imperfect Mandarin. Listening to Victoria's practice session, Maria had felt a mixture of sympathy and frustration. It was clear that Victoria was under enormous pressure, and equally clear that her Mandarin, while functional, lacked the nuance and cultural sensitivity that would be crucial for impressing investors like Zhangwei. Maria had observed enough high-level Chinese business meetings during her time at the import company to know that Zhang's team would be evaluating not just Victoria's business proposal, but her understanding of and respect for Chinese culture. Several times, Maria had been tempted to offer suggestions or corrections, but she had learned from experience that such overtures were rarely welcome. Her position as domestic help created an invisible barrier that few employers were interested in crossing, and Maria had no reason to believe Victoria would be different. The morning had passed in tense silence, with Victoria growing increasingly agitated as the meeting time approached. Her assistant, Jennifer Walsh, had arrived at 10 to help with final preparations, and the two women had spent hours going over every detail of the presentation, the catering arrangements, and the cultural protocols Victoria had memorized. "Remember," Jennifer had said, consulting her notes, "Zhang Wei expects to be greeted first, as the senior member of the delegation. The handshake should be brief but firm, and you should present your business card with both hands." The consultant said that showing respect for hierarchy is crucial. Victoria had nodded, her jaw tense with concentration. "I've got it. Greet Zhang first, then his lieutenants in order of seniority. Present the business plan in both English and Mandarin. Show respect for their experience and success in the Chinese market." Maria, who was arranging fresh flowers in the living room, had winced internally at Victoria's pronunciation of several Mandarin phrases during this rehearsal. The tones were off, and some of the more formal expressions Victoria was planning to use carried connotations that might actually be insulting in the context she intended to use them. But Maria had said nothing, focusing on her flowers while the two women continued their preparations. The Zhangwei delegation had arrived precisely at 2 p.m., a punctuality that Victoria had been warned to expect. Zhang himself was a distinguished man in his 60s, dressed in an impeccably tailored dark suit, accompanied by 4 associates who moved with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to wielding significant power. Victoria had greeted them in the marble foyer of her penthouse, following the protocols she had memorized, and Maria had watched from the kitchen as the group was escorted to the conference area. Victoria had set up in her living room. For the first hour, the meeting had proceeded smoothly. Victoria's presentation had been professional and comprehensive, covering Chen Dynamics' history, its current challenges, and the opportunities that Zhang's investment could unlock. The financial projections were solid, the market analysis was thorough, and Victoria's passion for her company was evident in every word. But Maria had noticed the subtle signs that Victoria was missing. Zhang's associates had exchanged glances during certain portions of the presentation, and their questions had carried undertones that suggested they were testing Victoria's understanding of Chinese business culture rather than simply seeking information. These were sophisticated investors who had heard countless pitches from American entrepreneurs, and they were evaluating Victoria on multiple levels simultaneously. The turning point had come when Zhang himself had begun to speak, switching from the English he had used for pleasantries to rapid, complex Mandarin as he discussed his concerns about the American market and his expectations for any company he might choose to invest in. His words were nuanced, filled with cultural references and business terminology that required not just language skills but deep cultural knowledge to fully understand. Victoria had followed along reasonably well at first, her Mandarin sufficient to grasp the basic meaning of Zhang's comments. But as the conversation became more complex, involving detailed discussions of guanxi, the intricate system of relationships that govern Chinese business culture, And mianzi, the concept of face that was crucial to understanding Chinese professional interactions. Victoria had begun to struggle. Her responses had become increasingly hesitant, and Maria could see the frustration building in Victoria's eyes as she realized she was losing control of the most important meeting of her professional life. The cultural nuances that the consultant had briefed her on were one thing in theory, but navigating them in real-time conversation with native speakers was proving to be far more challenging than Victoria had anticipated. Zhang had been discussing the importance of long-term relationships in Chinese business culture, explaining how his investment decisions were based not just on financial projections, but on his confidence in the character and cultural sensitivity of the entrepreneurs he chose to support. His words had been elegant and philosophical, touching on concepts that had roots in thousands of years of Chinese civilization. Victoria had tried to respond appropriately, but her reply had inadvertently used a phrase that, while grammatically correct, carried implications of superiority that were deeply inappropriate in the context. The mistake had been subtle, the kind of error that would go unnoticed by most Americans but was glaringly obvious to native Mandarin speakers. The reaction from Zhang's team had been immediate and unmistakable. Eyebrows had raised, glances had been exchanged, and the atmosphere in the room had shifted from professional interest to polite skepticism. Zhang himself had maintained his composure, but Maria could see the disappointment in his eyes as he realized that Victoria, despite her obvious intelligence and business acumen, lacked the cultural depth he considered essential for a successful partnership. What followed had been a masterclass in polite rejection, conducted with the kind of diplomatic grace that made the dismissal even more devastating. Zhang had complimented Victoria's business plan, praised her achievements, and expressed admiration for her entrepreneurial spirit, all while making it clear that Golden Dragon Ventures would not be investing in Chen Dynamics. The reasons he gave were couched in terms of timing and market conditions, but everyone in the room understood the real message. Victoria had failed the cultural competency test that was a prerequisite for his investment. Victoria had tried to salvage the situation, switching back to English to make her final appeal, but the damage had been done. Zhang's team had been courteous but distant as they prepared to leave, going through the motions of exchanging business cards and promising to stay in touch in the way that everyone recognized as diplomatic closure. It was at this moment, as Victoria watched her last hope walking toward the door, that desperation had finally overwhelmed her professional composure. "Please," she had called out, her voice cracking with emotion. "You have to understand, this company is everything to me. I know I made mistakes with the language, but I can learn. I can adapt. I understand what you need." Zhang had paused, turning back with an expression of genuine sympathy. "Miss Chen," he had said gently, switching back to English, "your passion is evident, and your business plan has merit, but successful partnerships require more than good intentions. They require genuine understanding, not just of language, but of culture, of values, of the subtle ways in which we conduct relationships in my country. These things cannot be learned in preparation for a single meeting." The rejection had been delivered with such kindness that it was somehow more devastating than if it had been harsh. Victoria had stood frozen in her living room as the delegation made their way to the elevator, the sound of the closing doors echoing like a death knell for her company. In the silence that followed, Victoria had felt the weight of her failure settling over her like a physical presence. 18 months of work, countless sleepless nights, the sacrifice of personal relationships and her own health, all of it had come down to this moment, and she had fallen short. The cultural gap she had tried to bridge with preparation and determination had proven unbridgeable, at least for her. It was then that she had noticed Maria, still standing quietly in the kitchen where she had been cleaning up the catering dishes. For the first time, Victoria really looked at the woman who had been working in her home for weeks, seeing her not as part of the background, but as an actual person. And in that moment of clarity, something in Maria's expression, a hint of understanding, of shared frustration, caught Victoria's attention. "You understand, don't you?" Victoria had said suddenly, her voice hollow with defeat. "You were listening. You know what just happened here." Maria had hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being directly addressed, before nodding slowly. "I'm sorry for your loss," she had said quietly, her formal English carrying a trace of an accent that Victoria hadn't really noticed before. "Loss," Victoria had repeated bitterly. "That's exactly what it is. Not just the investment, but everything. The company, the jobs, the dream. All of it gone, because I couldn't convince one man that I understand his culture. She had walked to the window, staring out at the Seattle skyline that had once represented her kingdom, but now felt like a view from a prison. 6 years building this company, she had continued, speaking more to herself than to Maria. 6 years of 80-hour weeks, of sacrificing everything for success. And it all comes down to cultural nuances I'll never truly master. Maria had continued her cleaning. But Victoria could sense that she was listening. That unlike most people in Victoria's life, she wasn't trying to offer empty reassurance or quick solutions. There was something calming about her presence, a quiet dignity that Victoria found oddly comforting in her moment of despair. The irony is that my parents came here from China, Victoria had said, still staring out the window. They spoke Mandarin in our home when I was growing up, insisted I learn it properly. But they also wanted me to be American, to succeed in American business culture. They thought if I could master both worlds, I'd have unlimited opportunities. She had turned back to face Maria, who was now wiping down the conference table where Victoria's dreams had just died. Instead, I'm trapped between both worlds, never quite enough of either. Too Chinese for some American investors, too American for Chinese ones, always proving myself, never quite belonging anywhere. Maria had looked up from her work, and for just a moment Victoria had seen something in her eyes that suggested she understood this feeling of cultural displacement more personally than her position as domestic help would suggest. Sometimes the bridge between worlds is not about mastering both cultures perfectly, Maria had said carefully, but about finding someone who can help you navigate the crossing. There had been something in the way she phrased this, a formality and precision that seemed at odds with her role as a cleaning lady, but Victoria had been too consumed with her own crisis to pay close attention to the nuance. Easy to say, Victoria had replied, slumping into one of her expensive leather chairs. But I don't have time to find cultural ambassadors or language tutors. Zhang Wei was my last realistic option. After today's disaster gets around the investment community, no one else is going to take meetings with me. She had buried her face in her hands, the full magnitude of her situation finally hitting her. I have maybe 6 weeks before I have to start laying off staff. 12 weeks before we're completely insolvent. There's no coming back from this. Maria had finished cleaning the table and had been gathering her supplies when she paused, clearly debating whether to speak. Finally, she had said, Mr. Zhang mentioned something about the importance of guanxi, of building relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. Perhaps the meeting was not the failure you believe it was. Victoria had looked up sharply. Were you listening to the entire conversation? Because I'm pretty sure I just spectacularly failed to demonstrate either respect or understanding. Language mistakes can be forgiven, Maria had said, her voice still quiet but carrying more confidence now. Cultural insensitivity cannot. But you showed respect by learning what you could, by trying to communicate in his language, by acknowledging the importance of his cultural values. These things matter, even when the execution is imperfect. Victoria had stared at Maria, suddenly registering not just her words but the way she was speaking. The formality, the careful grammar, the sophisticated vocabulary. This was not the speech pattern of someone whose primary language was something other than English. Nor was it the typical communication style of domestic workers she had encountered. How do you know so much about Chinese business culture? Victoria had asked, her executive instincts finally kicking in despite her emotional state. Maria had frozen, clearly realizing she had revealed more than she intended. I've worked for other clients who do business internationally, she had said, but the explanation sounded rehearsed and incomplete. For the first time all day, Victoria had felt her analytical mind engaging with something other than her own failure. Here was a puzzle, a mystery that was distracting her from the disaster of the Jiangwei meeting. What other clients? She had pressed. I'm not supposed to discuss other assignments, Maria had replied. But she looked uncomfortable, like someone who was telling the truth but not the whole truth. Victoria had stood up, her businessman's instincts fully awakened now. Maria, right? Maria Santos? Maria had nodded, clearly wishing she could disappear. How long have you been working for Elite Domestic Services? 3 years, Maria had answered, but her body language suggested she wanted to end this conversation and leave. And before that? Maria had hesitated for a long moment before saying, I worked in import-export for a while. Import-export, Victoria had repeated, her mind racing. What kind of import-export? Nothing relevant to your business, Maria had said quickly, clearly regretting having said anything at all. I should finish up and get out of your way. I'm sure you have things to take care of after your meeting. But Victoria had been like a bloodhound with a scent now, her natural curiosity and business instincts overriding her politeness. Maria, you've been working in my home for weeks. You've overheard phone calls, seen documents, watched me prepare for today's meeting. You know more about my business situation than most of my own employees. Maria had looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot like someone who wanted to run but couldn't figure out how to do so politely. I'm not asking you to violate any confidentiality agreements, Victoria had continued, moving closer to Maria, her voice taking on the intensity that had made her successful in negotiations. But you clearly understood what happened in that meeting better than I did. You recognized the cultural significance of what Zhang was saying, didn't you? After a long pause, Maria had nodded reluctantly. Some of it, yes. How much Mandarin do you speak? Victoria had asked directly. Maria had looked like she wanted to lie. But something in Victoria's expression must have convinced her that evasion was no longer an option. I'm fluent, she had admitted quietly. Victoria had felt her heart skip a beat. Fluent? Conversationally fluent or actually fluent? I have a degree in international business with a focus on Asian markets, Maria had said, the words coming out in a rush, as if she was finally relieved to stop hiding. I spent 2 years working for a Chinese import company in Los Angeles. I speak Mandarin, Cantonese, some Japanese, and I understand Chinese business culture probably better than most Americans. Victoria had stared at her, processing this information. Then what are you doing cleaning houses? The question had hung in the air between them, carrying implications that both women understood. Maria had straightened her shoulders, and for the first time since Victoria had known her, she had looked directly into Victoria's eyes with something approaching defiance. Because despite my qualifications, despite my language skills, despite my education, the only people willing to hire me were domestic service companies, Maria had said, her voice steady but filled with years of accumulated frustration. Because my resume might be impressive, but my name is Maria Santos, and I don't look like what most executives expect international business consultants to look like. The honesty of this statement had hit Victoria like a physical blow. Here was someone who had been invisible to her for weeks, someone she had dismissed without a second thought, who possessed exactly the skills and knowledge that could have prevented today's disaster. The irony was so profound that Victoria had felt dizzy with the implications. You could have helped me prepare for this meeting, Victoria had said, her voice barely above a whisper. You knew what I was getting wrong. You never asked, Maria had replied simply. In 3 years of domestic work, not one client has ever asked me about my background, my education, or my opinions about their business affairs. To you, I was invisible until this moment. Victoria had sunk back into her chair, the full weight of her own blindness settling over her. I dismissed you, she had said, the words coming out like a confession. I literally dismissed you as irrelevant to my success. Most people do, Maria had said, not unkindly. It's not personal, it's just the way the world works. But Victoria had been thinking now, her mind racing with possibilities that seemed too incredible to be real. Maria, if you had been in that meeting today, could you have helped me navigate the cultural issues? Could you have prevented what happened? Maria had considered this question seriously before answering. I think I could have helped you understand what Mr. Zhang was really asking for, yes. The mistakes you made weren't about language proficiency. They were about cultural context, about understanding the subtext of formal Chinese business communication. Could you still help me? Victoria had asked, desperate hope creeping into her voice. Is there any way to salvage this situation? Maria had looked skeptical. Mr. Zhang seemed pretty definitive in his rejection. In Chinese business culture, once a decision like that has been made, it's very difficult to reverse. But not impossible? Not impossible, Maria had admitted. But it would require a completely different approach. You couldn't just call him back and ask for another meeting. You'd need to demonstrate that you understand what went wrong today, and that you've taken steps to address the cultural issues he identified. Victoria had felt the first spark of hope she'd experienced since Zhang's team walked out her door. What kind of steps? Maria had hesitated, clearly reluctant to get more involved than she already was. I shouldn't be giving you business advice. I'm here to clean your apartment, not consult on your corporate strategy. Forget about your job description for a minute, Victoria had said urgently. Pretend you're not the maid and I'm not the client. Just two people having a conversation about a business problem. What would you do? The question had clearly resonated with Maria, who had spent years being defined by other people's expectations rather than her own capabilities. She had taken a deep breath before answering. I would find a way to demonstrate genuine cultural competency, not just language skills, she had said. I would show Mr. Zhang that I understood the deeper meaning of what he was trying to communicate today. And I would prove that I had the kind of cultural advisors and partnerships that would ensure future interactions would be conducted with proper respect and understanding. Victoria had leaned forward, hanging on every word. How? There's a concept in Chinese culture called hu and suha, which roughly translates to knowing one's errors and being able to correct them, Maria had explained. It's considered one of the highest virtues. If you could find a way to acknowledge today's mistakes and demonstrate that you've learned from them, it might create an opening for renewed dialogue. And how would I do that? Maria had been quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. Finally, she had said, Mr. Zhang mentioned during the meeting that he'll be attending the Pacific Northwest Asian Business Association dinner next Friday. It's a major networking event that most of the Chinese business community in Seattle will attend. Victoria had grabbed her phone, already searching for information about the event. I can get tickets? I can approach him there. No, Maria had said firmly. Approaching him directly would be seen as pushy and disrespectful, especially after today. In Chinese culture, after a business rejection like this, the proper protocol is to step back and allow face-saving time to pass. Then what do you suggest? Maria had looked uncomfortable again, as if she was about to cross a line she had sworn not to cross. You would need an intermediary, someone who could approach Mr. Zhang on your behalf, someone who could communicate your understanding of today's mistakes and your commitment to doing better, someone who speaks the language fluently and understands the cultural protocols. The implication had hung in the air between them, so obvious that neither woman needed to state it explicitly. Victoria had stared at Maria, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since they'd met. You could do it, Victoria had said finally. You could be that intermediary. I am a domestic worker, Maria had protested. Mr. Zhang isn't going to take a meeting with someone who cleans houses. Not as a domestic worker, Victoria had said, her mind racing with possibilities. As my cultural advisor. As a legitimate business consultant who happens to have been working undercover in domestic services. Maria had looked skeptical. Even if I agreed to help you, which I'm not saying I am, what makes you think Mr. Zhang would believe that transformation? That he wouldn't see through it immediately? Victoria had stood up, pacing now with the kind of energy that had built her company in the first place. Because it wouldn't be a deception. It would be the truth. You are qualified to be a cultural advisor. You do understand Chinese business better than I do. The only reason you're not already working in that capacity is because people like me have been too blind to recognize your qualifications. She had stopped pacing and looked directly at Maria. I'm offering you a job. A real job. Using your actual skills. Cultural consultant for Chen Dynamics, starting immediately. Maria had stared at her, clearly not believing what she was hearing. You don't even know me. You don't know anything about my background beyond what I've told you in the last 10 minutes. I know enough, Victoria had said. I know you understood that meeting better than I did. I know you speak fluent Mandarin and understand Chinese business culture. I know you've been invisible in this industry despite being qualified, which means you're probably hungry for an opportunity to prove yourself. And I know that I just lost the most important business meeting of my life because I lacked exactly the expertise you possess. She had pulled out her phone and called her assistant. Jennifer, I need you to research Elite Domestic Services and get me everything they have on Maria Santos. Background, references, everything. Then I need you to draft an employment contract for a senior cultural consultant position, salary commensurate with similar roles at comparable companies. Maria had watched this conversation with something approaching shock. "You're serious," she had said when Victoria hung up. "Dead serious. My company is going to fail unless I can find a way to repair the damage from today's meeting. You're the only person I've met who might be able to help me do that. So yes, I'm serious. And if I can't deliver, if Mr. Zhang won't meet with me or won't reconsider his investment decision," Victoria had considered this question honestly, "then we'll have tried everything possible. And at least one qualified person will have gotten a chance to work in the field she was trained for, instead of being invisible in domestic service." There had been a long silence as Maria processed this offer. Finally, she had asked, "What exactly would you need me to do? Help me understand what went wrong today. Teach me what I need to know about Chinese business culture to avoid making those mistakes again. And yes, if you're willing, approach Zhang Wei or his associates to see if there's any possibility of reopening discussions." Maria had looked around the penthouse, taking in the expensive furniture and stunning views, then back at Victoria. "If I do this, if I take this job, I need you to understand something. I won't be your token diversity hire or your cultural mascot. I want to be treated as a legitimate business professional with valuable expertise." "Agreed," Victoria had said immediately. "And I want equity in the company if my intervention saves it." Victoria had felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth for the first time all day. "Now you're thinking like a businesswoman. We can negotiate terms, but yes, if you help save Chen Dynamics, you'll share in its success." Maria had extended her hand. "Then I guess I should give Elite Domestic Services my notice." As they shook hands, Victoria had felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone grasping at straws, but the genuine confidence that came from finding the right person for an impossible job. "There's just one thing," Maria had said as she gathered her cleaning supplies for what would be the last time. "If we're going to approach Mr. Zhang, we need to do this properly. No rushing, no American-style aggressive pursuit. We need to be patient, respectful, and strategic. How long are we talking about? At least a week to establish the proper groundwork. Maybe 2 before we can make any direct contact. Chinese business relationships are built slowly, with careful attention to protocol and face-saving measures." Victoria had nodded, though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to act immediately. "I'll trust your expertise. But Maria, I need you to understand how high the stakes are. I've got 6 weeks of operating capital left. If we can't turn this around soon, there won't be a company left to save." "I understand," Maria had said. "But Mr. Zhang has waited 60 years to build his empire. He's not going to be impressed by our American sense of urgency. If we want his respect, we have to operate on his timeline, not ours." The transformation began at dawn the next morning when Maria Santos walked into the Chen Dynamics headquarters, carrying a leather briefcase instead of cleaning supplies. Victoria had spent the night researching everything she could find about Maria's background. And what she discovered had left her both impressed and ashamed of her previous blindness. Maria Elena Rodriguez Santos had graduated summa cum laude from UCLA with a double major in international business and linguistics. Her thesis, titled Cultural Bridges in Sino-American Business Relations, Beyond Language to Understanding, had been published in the Journal of International Commerce and had been cited in dozens of subsequent academic papers. She had spent her junior year studying at Beijing University, where she had not only perfected her Mandarin, but had also developed relationships with students who were now rising stars in Chinese business and government. Her work experience included 2 years as a cultural liaison for Pacific Rim Import Solutions, where she had facilitated over $50 million in trade agreements between Chinese manufacturers and American retailers. Her references from that position described her as invaluable, culturally astute, and, quote, the most effective cross-cultural communicator we've ever worked with. The mystery wasn't why Maria was qualified for the position Victoria was offering her. The mystery was how someone with her credentials had ended up cleaning houses for 3 years. Victoria's investigation had revealed the answer in the form of a pattern that was both depressing and infuriating. Despite glowing recommendations and impressive qualifications, Maria had been passed over for dozens of international business positions in favor of candidates with less experience but more traditional backgrounds. The discrimination had been subtle, but systematic. Interview feedback consistently praised Maria's knowledge and communication skills, while expressing vague concerns about cultural fit or client presentation. One particularly honest rejection letter had suggested that while Maria was clearly competent, clients might be more comfortable with consultants who looked more executive. This revelation had kept Victoria awake most of the night, not just because of the injustice it represented, but because of what it said about her own role in perpetuating a system that wasted talent based on superficial judgments. She had built her career fighting against the glass ceiling that limited women in tech, but she had been completely blind to the barriers that had kept someone like Maria invisible. When Maria arrived at Chen Dynamics that Tuesday morning, she found Victoria waiting in the lobby personally, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the early arriving staff. Victoria had chosen to make Maria's hiring visible from the beginning, partly as a signal to her employees that things were changing, but mostly because she wanted to demonstrate immediately that Maria would be treated with the respect her qualifications demanded. "Welcome to Chen Dynamics," Victoria said, extending her hand formally. "I'm ready to learn everything you can teach me." Maria had dressed carefully for her first day, choosing a tailored navy suit that projected professional authority without ostentation. Her transformation from domestic worker to business consultant was complete on the surface, but Victoria could see traces of uncertainty in her eyes, the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust new opportunities too quickly. "Before we begin," Maria said as they rode the elevator to Victoria's executive floor, "I want to be clear about something. I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear about Mr. Zhang's investment decision. I'm going to tell you the truth, even if it's difficult to accept." Victoria nodded. "I need the truth. Sugarcoating the situation won't save my company." They settled in Victoria's office, and Maria opened her briefcase to reveal a stack of folders and notebooks. "I spent last night researching everything I could find about Golden Dragon Ventures and Zhang Wei's investment philosophy. What I learned confirms my initial assessment. Yesterday's meeting was more damaging than you realize." She opened one of the folders and spread several documents across Victoria's desk. "Zhang Wei doesn't just invest money. He builds long-term partnerships with companies he believes can serve as bridges between Chinese and American business cultures. He's looking for entrepreneurs who understand that success in the global marketplace requires genuine cultural competency, not just market knowledge." Victoria studied the documents, which included profiles of companies in Golden Dragon's portfolio. These are all firms with significant Chinese partnerships or market presence. "Exactly, and look at the leadership teams." Maria pointed to several executive bios. "Every single portfolio company has senior leadership with deep Chinese cultural knowledge. Not just language skills, but people who understand Guanxi, Mianzi, and the complex relationship dynamics that govern Chinese business." The implications were becoming clear to Victoria. "He wasn't just evaluating my business plan yesterday. He was evaluating whether I could be a cultural bridge. And unfortunately, your presentation demonstrated the opposite," Maria said gently. "The language mistakes were minor. The real problem was that you approached the meeting like an American negotiation, focused on metrics and projections, when what Zhang needed to see was your understanding of relationship building and cultural respect." Victoria leaned back in her chair, processing this feedback. "So when I tried to sell him on our growth potential and market position, I was actually proving that I didn't understand what he values most." "Right. Chinese business culture prioritizes relationships over transactions, long-term thinking over quarterly results, and cultural harmony over competitive advantage. Your presentation, however impressive by American standards, demonstrated American business values that are often at odds with Chinese ones." Maria pulled out another document, this one covered with handwritten notes in both English and Chinese characters. "I've been thinking about how to approach Mr. Zhang, and I believe there's a way to demonstrate that you've learned from yesterday's mistakes. But it requires completely changing your strategy." "Tell me." "First, we need to acknowledge the cultural missteps openly and respectfully. In Chinese culture, admitting error and showing genuine commitment to improvement is seen as a sign of wisdom and character. Second, we need to demonstrate that you now have the cultural guidance necessary to avoid similar mistakes in the future." Victoria felt a flutter of hope. "You think he might be willing to reconsider?" "I think he might be willing to listen, but only if we approach this correctly. And that means following Chinese protocols for relationship repair, which are very different from American ones." Maria stood and walked to the window overlooking downtown Seattle. There's something else you need to understand about Zhang Wei specifically. I did some research into his background last night, and he has a personal history that makes cultural sensitivity particularly important to him. She turned back to Victoria with a serious expression. Sung came to America as a graduate student in the 1980s. Despite having a PhD in engineering from Tsinghua University, he faced significant discrimination here. American companies wouldn't hire him for positions commensurate with his qualifications because they doubted his ability to fit into American corporate culture. Victoria felt a chill of recognition. Like what happened to you? Exactly. Zhang eventually returned to China and built his empire there. But he's never forgotten the experience of being underestimated and dismissed because of cultural prejudice. That's why he's so selective about his American investments. He's looking for entrepreneurs who demonstrate genuine respect for cultural diversity, not just tolerance for it. The weight of this revelation settled over Victoria like a physical presence. Which means yesterday's meeting wasn't just a business failure. It was a personal disappointment for him. I believe so, but it also means that if we can demonstrate genuine growth and understanding, it might resonate with him on a personal level. Maria returned to her seat and opened another folder. I have a proposal for how to proceed, but it's going to require patience and a complete departure from American business practices. I'm listening. We start by attending the Pacific Northwest Asian Business Association dinner on Friday, but not to approach Zhang directly. Instead, we go to learn, to observe, and to begin building relationships within the broader Chinese business community in Seattle. Maria pulled out a list of names and organizations. I've identified 12 key figures who will be at the dinner, people who have existing relationships with Zhang Wei and Golden Dragon Ventures. Our goal is to begin building genuine relationships with these individuals, not as a means to an end, but as a foundation for long-term cultural competency. Victoria studied the list, recognizing several names from the Seattle business community. This is a 2 or 3 month strategy, isn't it? Not a quick fix. At minimum, authentic relationship building can't be rushed. But Victoria, I need you to understand something. Even if this doesn't ultimately lead to Zhang's investment, it will make you a better leader and your company more capable of succeeding in the global marketplace. The honesty of this statement impressed Victoria more than any sales pitch could have. You're not promising me a miracle. I'm promising you transformation if you're willing to do the work. But the work involves fundamentally changing how you think about business relationships, not just learning new cultural protocols. Victoria looked around her office, taking in the awards and photos that chronicled her rise in the tech industry. Everything she had built was at stake, but Maria was asking her to risk even more. Her fundamental approach to business, her comfort zone, her identity as a leader. What's the first step? She asked. Maria smiled for the first time since entering the office. The first step is admitting that everything you thought you knew about international business was incomplete. The second step is deciding whether your pride is more important than your company's survival. Over the next 3 days, Victoria received an intensive education in Chinese business culture that was unlike anything she had experienced in business school or corporate seminars. Maria's teaching approach was immersive and practical, focusing not just on protocols and customs, but on the underlying philosophy that governed Chinese professional relationships. They started with language, but not the kind of language instruction Victoria had expected. Instead of drilling grammar and vocabulary, Maria focused on the cultural concepts embedded in Chinese business communication. She explained how the same phrase could carry entirely different meanings depending on context, tone, and relationship dynamics between speakers. Americans tend to view language as a tool for transmitting information, Maria explained during one of their sessions. Chinese business communication is more about maintaining harmony, showing respect, and preserving face for all parties involved. The actual information being transmitted is often secondary to these relationship considerations. They practiced conversations where Victoria had to navigate complex scenarios involving hierarchy, face-saving, and indirect communication. It was exhausting and humbling work that required Victoria to completely recalibrate her natural communication style. In yesterday's meeting with Zhang, Maria said during one practice session, when he complimented your presentation before rejecting your proposal, he was following a protocol designed to allow you to maintain face despite the rejection. Your response should have acknowledged his consideration and expressed gratitude for his guidance, not desperation for another chance. Victoria winced as she realized how her emotional reaction had violated cultural norms she hadn't even known existed. "I was focused on saving the deal instead of respecting the relationship." "Exactly. And by doing so, you demonstrated that you didn't understand the cultural values that are fundamental to how Zheng conducts business." Beyond language and communication, Maria introduced Victoria to the concept of guanxi, the complex network of relationships that formed the foundation of Chinese business culture. This wasn't simply networking in the American sense, but a sophisticated system of mutual obligation, loyalty, and long-term relationship management. "Guanxi can't be built quickly or transactionally," Maria explained. "It requires genuine investment in other people's success, authentic personal connections, and a long-term perspective that many American executives struggle with." They mapped out the relationships between various figures in Seattle's Chinese business community, identifying not just who knew whom, but the nature and history of those relationships. Victoria began to understand that approaching Jiang Wei without proper introductions and relationship foundations had been not just ineffective, but actually counterproductive. American business culture celebrates the cold call, the bold approach, the entrepreneur who forces their way into important rooms, Maria said. Chinese business culture views these behaviors as disrespectful and immature. Relationship building follows established patterns that have been refined over thousands of years. By Thursday, Victoria felt like she was learning to speak and think in an entirely new language, one that challenged every assumption she had made about effective business practices. The transformation was uncomfortable and often frustrating, but she could feel her understanding deepening in ways that went beyond cultural sensitivity to genuine appreciation for different approaches to commerce and relationships. The Friday evening Asian Business Association dinner was held at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, in a ballroom that had been decorated with subtle elegance befitting the influential guest list. Victoria arrived wearing a conservative black dress that Maria had helped her select, her hair styled simply, her jewelry minimal. The goal was to project respect and professionalism without calling attention to herself. Maria had coached her extensively on proper etiquette for the evening. They would arrive together, with Maria serving as Victoria's cultural advisor, a role that would be clearly established in their introductions. They would not seek out Jiang Wei directly, but would focus on meeting other attendees and building foundations for future relationships. "Remember," Maria had said during their final preparation session, "tonight is not about making deals or even making strong impressions. It's about demonstrating respect, showing cultural awareness, and beginning the slow process of becoming part of this community." The ballroom was filled with several hundred guests, a mixture of Asian business leaders, local politicians, and American executives with interests in Pacific Rim commerce. Victoria spotted Jiang Wei almost immediately, engaged in conversation with a group of distinguished older men near the far end of the room. "Don't look directly at him," Maria murmured. "Let's focus on meeting people who can provide proper introductions when the time is right." They began with Dr. James Liu, a professor of international business at the University of Washington, who had extensive connections throughout the Asian business community. Maria's introduction was smooth and professional, establishing her credentials without overselling her role. "Dr. Liu, I'd like you to meet Victoria Chen, CEO of Chen Dynamics, and I'm Maria Santos, her cultural advisor for Asian market development," Maria said in perfect Mandarin before switching to English. "We're honored to be here tonight and hope to learn from the community's wisdom." Dr. Liu's response was warm but evaluative. He asked thoughtful questions about Chen Dynamics' business model and Victoria's background, but Victoria could sense that he was also assessing her cultural competency and sincerity. Following Maria's coaching, Victoria focused on asking questions rather than promoting her company, showing genuine interest in Dr. Liu's research and perspectives on Sino-American business relations. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, covering topics from technology trends to cultural challenges in international business. Victoria found herself genuinely engaged, not just performing the role of interested listener, but actually learning from Dr. Liu's insights. When they finally moved on to meet other attendees, Dr. Liu handed Victoria his business card with both hands and invited her to attend a lecture he was giving the following week. "That went well," Maria said quietly as they walked toward their next introduction. "He's going to remember you positively, and he has significant influence with Zheng's circle." They spent the next hour meeting other attendees, each conversation following a similar pattern. Maria would make introductions that established the professional context. Victoria would engage in substantive discussions about business and cultural topics, and they would conclude with expressions of mutual respect and interest in future dialogue. Victoria began to understand that what they were doing wasn't networking in the American sense of collecting contacts and promoting opportunities. Instead, they were demonstrating cultural competency, showing respect for established community relationships, and positioning themselves as serious participants in cross-cultural business dialogue. It was during their conversation with Helen Zhang, no relation to Zhang Wei but a prominent import-export executive, that Victoria first noticed Zhang Wei watching them from across the room. The observation was subtle, just a glance in their direction during a pause in his own conversation, but Maria noticed it too. "He's aware of us," Maria murmured. "That's good. It means our approach is working." "Should we approach him now?" Victoria asked. "Absolutely not. Let him observe us. Let him see that we're here to participate in the community, not to pursue him specifically." The restraint required for this approach was almost physically painful for Victoria, whose instincts screamed at her to seize the opportunity for direct contact. But she forced herself to trust Maria's guidance, continuing to focus on the conversations at hand rather than the potential investor across the room. The breakthrough came during their conversation with Robert Chen, a venture capitalist who specialized in Asian market investments. Robert had been friendly but professional until he learned about Victoria's recent meeting with Zhang Wei. "You met with Zhang Wei about investment in Chen Dynamics?" he asked, his tone becoming more serious. Victoria felt Maria tense beside her, and she carefully followed the script they had practiced for this moment. "I had the honor of presenting to Mr. Zhang and his team last week," she said respectfully. "Unfortunately, I demonstrated insufficient cultural competency for the partnership he was seeking." Robert's eyebrows rose at this honest admission. "That's an unusually direct acknowledgement." "It's the truth," Victoria replied. "I approached the meeting with American business assumptions and failed to show proper respect for Chinese cultural values. I'm here tonight, hoping to learn how to do better." This admission, which went against every instinct Victoria had about presenting strength and confidence, seemed to have exactly the effect Maria had predicted. Robert's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine respect. "Growth requires acknowledging mistakes," he said, unconsciously echoing the Chinese proverb Maria had taught Victoria. "What are you doing to address the cultural gaps you identified?" Victoria gestured toward Maria. "I've hired Miss Santos as my cultural advisor. She has extensive experience in Sino-American business relations and is helping me understand the cultural competencies I need to develop." Robert turned his attention to Maria, asking her several questions in Mandarin about her background and qualifications. Maria's responses were confident and detailed, establishing her credentials while showing appropriate deference to Robert's position in the community. "Interesting," Robert said, switching back to English. "Miss Santos, your reputation precedes you. I remember reading your thesis on cultural bridges in international commerce. It was quite insightful." Victoria felt a surge of pride in Maria's expertise, but also a renewed sense of shame at how long it had taken her to recognize those qualifications. Maria handled the recognition gracefully, neither downplaying her expertise nor overselling her role. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, with Robert sharing his own experiences navigating cultural challenges in international business. By the time they parted, Victoria felt that they had made a genuine connection, not just a networking contact. "That was significant," Maria said as they moved toward the dinner seating area. "Robert Chen has Zhang Wei's ear, and he's going to remember this conversation positively." As they found their assigned table, Victoria noticed that they had been seated relatively close to Zhang Wei's table, close enough to observe, but not so close as to seem presumptuous. She suspected Maria had requested this specific positioning when she had RSVP'd for the event. Dinner passed pleasantly, with Victoria engaging in substantive conversations with the other guests at her table, while occasionally noticing Zhang Wei's glances in their direction. She was beginning to understand that in Chinese business culture, these subtle observations and indirect assessments were as important as formal meetings. The evening's program included several speakers discussing trade relationships and cultural exchange between Asia and the Pacific Northwest. Victoria found herself genuinely interested in the presentations, not just because of their relevance to her current situation, but because they offered perspectives on international business that she had never seriously considered. It was during the final presentation, given by a successful Chinese-American entrepreneur about building bridges between business cultures, that Victoria felt Zhang Wei's attention focus more directly on their table. The speaker was discussing the importance of acknowledging cultural mistakes and demonstrating genuine commitment to cross-cultural understanding. True cultural competency, the speaker said, requires humility, patience, and the willingness to be transformed by the process of learning. It cannot be acquired through training programs or quick immersion experiences. It must be lived and practiced until it becomes part of who you are as a business leader. Victoria felt these words resonate deeply, not just as strategic guidance, but as a personal challenge. She realized that what she was undertaking with Maria's help wasn't just a business strategy to save her company, but a fundamental transformation of her approach to leadership and relationships. As the evening concluded and guests began to mingle again, Victoria and Maria were approached by Dr. Liu, whom they had met earlier in the evening. "Miss Chen, Miss Santos," he said warmly, "I wanted to introduce you to someone before the evening ends." Victoria's heart rate accelerated as she realized Dr. Liu was leading them toward Zhang Wei, who was standing with a small group near the ballroom's exit. This was the moment she had been hoping for and dreading, the opportunity to demonstrate whether she had learned anything from her previous mistakes. "Mr. Zhang," Dr. Liu said in Mandarin, "I'd like you to meet Victoria Chen of Chen Dynamics and her cultural advisor, Maria Santos." Zhang Wei turned toward them with polite interest, his expression giving nothing away. Victoria followed Maria's coaching exactly, greeting Zhang with appropriate formality and expressing gratitude for the introduction without any reference to their previous meeting or future possibilities. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Zhang," Victoria said in carefully practiced Mandarin. "Dr. Liu speaks very highly of your contributions to fostering cultural understanding in international business." Zhang's response was courteous but measured. Dr. Liu was generous with his praise. "Are you enjoying this evening's program?" What followed was a brief but significant conversation about the evening's presentations and the challenges of cross-cultural business development. Victoria focused entirely on asking thoughtful questions and expressing genuine interest in Zhang's perspectives, avoiding any hint of sales pitch or business opportunity discussion. Maria contributed to the conversation when appropriate, demonstrating her cultural knowledge while maintaining proper deference to the hierarchical relationships in the group. Victoria could see Zhang assessing Maria's credentials and qualifications, and she sensed his approval of Victoria's decision to work with such a qualified cultural advisor. The conversation lasted only about 10 minutes, but Victoria felt that it accomplished everything Maria had hoped for. They had demonstrated cultural competency, shown respect for proper protocols, and established themselves as serious participants in cross-cultural business dialogue. As the conversation concluded, Zhang handed Victoria his business card with both hands. A gesture that Maria had taught her indicated respect and potential for future interaction. "Ms. Chen," Zhang said in English, "I wish you success in your cultural learning journey. It is a path that requires patience and humility, but it leads to wisdom." Victoria accepted the card with appropriate gratitude, following the protocols Maria had drilled into her. "Thank you, Mr. Zhang. Your guidance is appreciated." As Zhang's group moved toward the exit, Victoria felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The evening had gone exactly as Maria had planned, establishing foundations for future relationship building without rushing toward premature business discussions. "How did we do?" Victoria asked quietly as they gathered their coats. "We did exactly what we needed to do," Maria replied. "We demonstrated growth, respect, and genuine cultural engagement," Mr. Zhang noticed, and he'll remember this evening positively. "What happens next?" "Now we wait. And we continue building relationships within the community." This was just the first step in a longer journey. As they left the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, Victoria realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of business and leadership. The evening had been about much more than positioning herself for Zhang Wei's reconsideration. It had been about becoming the kind of leader who could truly succeed in an interconnected global economy. "Maria," she said as they walked toward the parking garage, "I need to thank you for something more than just your professional expertise." "What's that?" "For showing me how much I didn't know about my own limitations. 6 months ago, I thought I was a sophisticated international businesswoman. Tonight I realized I was barely scratching the surface of what that actually means. Maria smiled, the first truly relaxed expression Victoria had seen from her since they'd started working together. That realization is the beginning of real wisdom, and it's exactly what Mr. Zhang was looking for when he met with you last week. Do you think he'll give us another chance? I think he'll give you the opportunity to earn another chance. But Victoria, you need to understand that this process is going to change you and your company in ways you can't predict. Are you prepared for that level of transformation? Victoria looked back at the hotel, where she had just experienced the most culturally sophisticated business evening of her life, then forward toward a future that felt both uncertain and full of possibility. 6 weeks ago, I would have said no. Tonight, I'm ready to find out. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.